than
there is
any
a name
surname
that survived
could ever tell you.
years of fire,
If you want more stories where the evidence quietly rewrites the map,
quietly in birth
let me know in the
certificates,
comments
gravestones,
and
or which
family
population
Bibles
and almost no one who carries it
next.
knows what it actually means. For generations, certain surnames were treated as folklore. Charming, decorative, a nice story to tell at a family dinner. We're supposedly descended from Vikings, someone would say, half joking, because the surnames sounded rugged, or a grandmother once mentioned a longship, or a family crest featured an axe. It was treated as myth, not history. Then the DNA arrived. And what it revealed was not simply confirmation of an old story. It was something stranger. Some of these rare surnames traced back to bloodlines that never touched Scandinavia at all. Others revealed ancestry so old, so widely scattered, that the label Viking started to feel too small for what the genome was actually showing. This is the story of 12 rare surnames, the warrior mythology built around them, and the genetic record that has begun, carefully and imperfectly, to test that mythology against something deeper than memory. If stories like this fascinate you, where a name becomes a thread into a much older human story, stay with this one, because the ending is not what most people expect. For most of modern history, the Viking surname idea rested on a fairly simple narrative. Between roughly the late 8th and 11th centuries, seafaring populations from what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden raided, traded, and settled across enormous distances, the British Isles, Normandy, Iceland, the Baltic coast, even reaching into the river systems of Eastern Europe and, according to some evidence, as far as the edges of North America. Surnames that sounded Norse, or that were tied to regions with strong Viking settlement, were assumed to be a kind of genetic fossil, a name passed down in an unbroken male line from an actual raider or settler 1,000 years ago. It was a tidy story. Names like Ivarsson, Ragnvald, Torvaldsson, or English Scandinavian hybrids like Rendel, Skelton, or Fenwick were treated almost like heirlooms, proof, in a single word, of ancestral steel. And on the surface, it seemed reasonable. Historians had documented the settlements. Place names across northern England, Scotland, Ireland, and Normandy still carry Norse linguistic fingerprints. Surnames often do trace back to a real historical anchor point. Why wouldn't a Norse-sounding name mean Norse blood? But almost as soon as researchers began comparing surname distribution to genetic markers, the first cracks appeared. Some families with unmistakably Norse surnames showed Y chromosome lineages that had nothing to do with Scandinavia at all, lineages more common in Iberia or in the pre-Viking populations of the British Isles. Meanwhile, some families with plain English, Irish, or Scottish surnames, names with no Norse sound to them whatsoever, carried Y-DNA haplogroups strongly associated with the historic Viking homelands. The name and the genome were not always telling the same story. This is where the first real tension enters. Surnames are cultural inheritance. They pass down through legal naming conventions, adoption, remarriage, and social prestige. A name can survive even when the biological line that first carried it does not continue unbroken. A Norse name could be adopted by a local family that married into a Scandinavian settler clan, absorbing the name without absorbing quite the ancestry people assumed. Or a name could persist while the actual Y chromosome lineage quietly changed hands generations ago through an unrecorded event no family history would ever mention. Genealogists had a rough sense of this, but it took genetics to make it undeniable. This is where genomic science enters the story, not as a footnote, but as the turning point. 3 tools reshaped the investigation. The first is mitochondrial DNA, passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, which allows researchers to trace maternal lineages across many centuries. The second is the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, which is especially useful for surname research because in most European naming traditions, surnames and Y chromosomes have historically traveled down the same paternal line. The third, and by far the most powerful, is autosomal whole genome analysis, a method that looks at DNA inherited from all ancestral lines, not just the strictly maternal or paternal one, allowing scientists to estimate broad ancestral proportions and detect ancient population mixing events. When researchers began applying these tools to both modern surname holders and, crucially, to ancient skeletal remains recovered from Viking Age burial sites in Scandinavia, Britain, and Iceland, the picture that emerged was not a simple confirmation of raider ancestry. It was something far more layered. Ancient genome analysis of Viking Age burials, including a large-scale study examining several hundred individuals from sites across Northern Europe, found that the people we call Vikings were never a single, genetically uniform group. Some individuals buried in classic Viking warrior graves, complete with weapons and ship burial customs, carried genetic ancestry pointing towards Southern Europe or the British Isles rather than pure Scandinavian origin. In other words, the identity Viking appears to have functioned, at least partly, as a cultural and economic identity, a way of life, a trade network, a warrior culture that people from genetically diverse backgrounds could enter into rather than a closed bloodline. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal, and it forced a harder question onto surname research specifically. If Viking identity itself was porous, then a modern surname tracing back to a Viking ancestor might be tracing back to someone who was culturally Norse but genetically something else entirely, or the reverse, someone genetically linked to Scandinavia who never used a Norse-sounding name at all. At this point in the investigation, researchers had to weigh several competing explanations, and none of them could be dismissed outright. The first possibility is straightforward admixture. Viking Age settlement in places like northern England, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, parts of Ireland, and Normandy involved real intermarriage between Norse settlers and local populations over multiple generations. A surname could reflect a founding Norse ancestor whose descendants steadily mixed with the surrounding population, diluting the genetic signal while the name endured. The second possibility is what geneticists sometimes call a ghost population effect, an ancestral group that contributed DNA to later populations but left little direct archaeological or written trace of its own distinct identity. Some of the ancestry detected in Viking genomes appears to predate the Viking Age itself by centuries, suggesting older migration layers into Scandinavia, from the Baltic region, from further east across the steppe, and from earlier Bronze and Iron Age movements that were already present in the population before any longship was ever built. The third possibility is founder effect and geographic isolation. Iceland offers a striking case. Genetic studies of the Icelandic population, partly enabled by that nation's unusually complete genealogical records, suggest that early Icelandic settlers carried a mixed ancestry, with a notable proportion of maternal lineages tracing to the British Isles rather than Scandinavia, even though the cultural and linguistic identity of the settlement was thoroughly Norse. Researchers suggest this may reflect Norse settlers bringing captives or partners from raided or traded regions, whose maternal lines then persisted for 1,000 years inside a population everyone would call, without hesitation, Viking. If you find this kind of scientific detective work compelling, you may want to subscribe because this is exactly the kind of question, where culture, name, and genome pull in different directions, that keeps rewriting what we think we know about the human past. The landmark moment in this field came from a large ancient DNA sequencing effort analyzing Viking Age skeletons recovered from burial sites stretching from Russia in the east to Greenland in the west. Researchers sequenced genomes from hundreds of individuals dated to the Viking period and compared them against both earlier Scandinavian populations and neighboring regions. The scale of the comparison mattered. Earlier, smaller studies could only hint at diversity. A dataset this size could actually map it. What the data showed was that Scandinavia during the Viking Age was already a genetically mixed region, shaped by earlier migrations from southern and eastern Europe, and that Viking Age mobility only intensified that mixing, pulling ancestry from the British Isles, the Baltic, and even the Sami populations of the far north into the broader Scandinavian gene pool. Some individuals found buried with full Viking warrior regalia in Scotland turned out to be genetically indistinguishable from the local population, not recent arrivals from Scandinavia at all, suggesting that local elites sometimes adopted Viking material culture and identity without any Norse ancestry whatsoever. Here is the twist, and it is not the twist most people expect. The rare surnames people assume connect them by blood directly to Norse raiders often turn out to be markers of something else, participation in a cultural and economic world that stretched further and pulled in more distinct populations than the sagas ever described. Not a single warrior bloodline passed cleanly down 1,000 years. Something wider. Something messier. A network of ancestry drawing from Slavic river trade routes, British and Irish coastal communities, Baltic populations, and even isolated genetic traces, ancestry connected to more distant trade contacts along the routes Norse merchants are known to have traveled toward Byzantium and the Caspian. The surprise was not that these families carried mixed ancestry. Nearly every European lineage does, once you look closely enough. The surprise was where some of the signals pointed, toward regions with no obvious cultural link to the Viking sagas at all, embedded quietly inside surnames that had always been marketed and believed as pure Norse heritage. The genome was not erasing the old story. It was revealing an older, wider one underneath it. This matters beyond genealogy hobbyists chasing a warrior ancestor. It reframes what the Viking Age actually was. Historians have long known that Norse expansion was not only military. It was commercial, exploratory, and deeply entangled with the populations it encountered. Genetics is now confirming at the level of individual family lines that this entanglement went far deeper than raiding parties and burned monasteries. It went into households, into marriages, into the next generation's cradle. Human migration, across almost every population geneticists have studied, does not move in clean, linear lines. It braids. Populations move, split, return, absorb strangers, lose distinctiveness, and reform new identities around shared language or shared gods rather than shared blood. The Vikings, it turns out, were not an exception to this pattern. They may be one of history's clearest examples of it, a cultural identity so successful that people from wildly different genetic backgrounds picked it up like a coat and wore it into legend. Picture, for a moment, a coastal settlement in 9th century Orkney. Wind moving low over gray stone and colder gray water. Longships pulled onto a beach that has seen 100 different peoples land on it across 1,000 years. Picts, Norse settlers, Irish monks, traders from places whose names have been lost to time. A child is born there to a Norse father and a mother whose own mother spoke a Gaelic dialect, in a household that will, within 2 generations, speak Norse, farm the land the old way, worship the old gods, and pass down a surname that will travel, eventually, thousands of miles from that shoreline into records no one in that house could have imagined: birth certificates, immigration papers, a DNA testing kit ordered online a millennium later. That name will still sound like a warrior's name to the descendants who carry it. And it will not be wrong, exactly. It will simply be smaller than the truth. That is the real inheritance these 12 surnames carry. Not a single unbroken warrior bloodline stretching back to one raider on one longship, but a genetic record of an age when peoples who might otherwise never have met were pulled together, by ships, by trade, by conquest, by marriage, by necessity, into something new. The Viking world was not a fortress of one bloodline defending its purity. It was a crossroads, and the genome remembers it as one. None of this diminishes the people who carry these names, or the very real Norse ancestry that many of them do carry, sometimes in striking proportion. If anything, it does the opposite. It suggests that Viking Age identity was resilient enough, and its world large enough, to absorb people from Ireland, Scotland, the Baltic, and beyond, and hand them a legacy still recognizable 1,000 years later in a surname on a modern family tree. The old story said, "This name proves your blood is Norse." The evidence suggests something both humbler and more remarkable. This name proves you carry a fragment of one of history's most far-reaching human networks, and no single test will ever fully unravel every thread of it. The map is still incomplete. Every new ancient genome recovered from a Viking Age grave adds another data point, and sometimes another contradiction, to a picture that keeps growing more intricate rather than more simple. Scientists remain cautious about assigning a precise percentage of Viking blood to any modern surname, because the underlying population itself was never genetically uniform to begin with. What the DNA has given us instead is something arguably more valuable than a clean answer. It has given us permission to stop imagining the past as a set of separate, sealed bloodlines, and to start seeing it as it actually was: restless, mixing, uncertain, and far more connected than any surname alone could ever tell you. If you want more stories where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, let me know in the comments which name or which population deserves to be investigated next.